Good morning again. I think we can start the first panel of today. Again, my name is Tammam Aloudat. I'm the CEO of the New Humanitarian, and I will be hosting this panel on humanitarian accountability. And as you've heard in the introduction, in the keynote discussion, we have an issue with accountability. I don't think we define it the same, practice it the same, or actually do what we say. Hans-Jörg went further than saying accountability to accountability lies with local organizations. And he said, accountability has to be with the people affected. And I couldn't agree more. And those of you who have stood up, of the 10 to 30 years range have probably heard the accountability to beneficiaries before, let alone the contradiction of beneficiaries where we define people not by anything other than them being receivers of aid. But it has happened. The discussion has happened. Yet, today, we still see accountability flowing top-down. It is still accountability about money. It is still that the choices and decisions are made at multiple layers above. We're still talking about operational accountability, and even that is in doubt. What we want to do today is, as it happens, to problematize the issue. Accountability is not reports, it's not Excel sheets, it is a different thing that we will try to pan out. Who's accountable to whom, and what does it mean? To do that, I have the pleasure of hosting the panel. My colleagues are Anisha Patel. She's a member of the Governing Council of Law for Palestine and head of Research and Discourse Department at Law for Palestine. She's also a PhD researcher at Europa Universitat Viadrina in Germany. Nour Khalil is the co-founder and executive director of Refugee Platform in Egypt and has considerable experience as a rights defender, providing legal consultations, documenting human rights violation in Egypt and beyond. And Anja Osterhaus has held leadership positions in multiple civil society organizations, human rights and press freedom, whistleblowing, and anti-corruption. She's worked for Oxfam and for Reporters Without Borders before. And in this panel, we will talk a little bit about definitions and about history. And I see the point that was raised. We could talk theoretically all day. What matters is what gets delivered. But I will also argue that you can't deliver out of gut feeling and good intentions. There is a critical debate to be had, and that cannot be entirely practical. There is a part that needs to be thought through. And to do that, I will start, Anja, with you. And our first discussion is, what is humanitarian accountability actually is? What are we talking about?
A very big question. Good morning, everybody. Accountability means I cannot do something just by myself as I wish. I am accountable to somebody or, to an organization, to people. People can hold me to account on what I do as well. And what has been said in the morning already rightly is that this accountability at the moment is far too often going into the sole direction towards the ones who provide the money for the work that is being done in humanitarianism. So organizations, local, international, national, all organizations tend to be more than anything else accountable to the donors, to the ones who provide the money. And then if we speak about Germany, our government will say, oh, we are accountable to the taxpayers. We need to explain to them how the money is being used that they give us. So the accountability is going into one direction, which could be one of many, but the key direction, which is towards the people we serve in our humanitarian work, which is what really counts, and that has been said very well in the opening sessions. This is often being neglected, or at least not taken as seriously as it absolutely has to be taken, because we have learned from so many cases and examples how wrong humanitarian aid can be applied if we don't listen, as we heard in the session before, if we don't listen to the people that need the support, that are put into situations which they absolutely, it's not their fault. They just end up in a situation because of the crisis, because of war, and they need something, and we are just the agents to give them what they need. So the accountability, of course, must go first and foremost to the people we serve, and then also to the donors. And unfortunately, this is not the case and the reality, despite the grand bargain and discussions about that since more than 10 years.
And we're talking about accountability as questioning. You said I can't do things by myself as I will, and that people can hold me to account. At this point, who are we talking about being held to account, Anja, in this context of humanitarianism?
I mean, the ones who administer this funding, it's all about the money and the power coming with the money. So the ones who are, like, if I can speak about Oxfam, where I've been working for 7 years, of course we were held to account by the donors, by the German government, by also the people who give money, donate money to Oxfam. They hold the humanitarian actors to account. We need to provide reports and spreadsheets, and we pass on this this obligation towards donor accountability on to our partners. And it creates constantly the wrong incentive. The incentive has to be, what do people need in the people we serve? What do they need? But they are in a weak position because they don't provide the money. The ones who provide the money can demand this reporting. And if it's not going in line with their requirements, they will there's always the risk of stopping to funding. And if they stop funding, it affects the people we serve, but it also affects ourselves, and it affects our offices and our staff. So it's constantly the wrong incentive. So if to change it to what we really need, and we were talking about we need to rethink humanitarianism. If we really want to change it to what is really needed, we constantly need to go against these incentives in international organizations and probably also in national and local organizations, often because ultimately the chain is passed on even to the local organizations, who ultimately also depend on the funding they get from somebody, and they need to fulfill these same reporting requirements. So it's a big effort, and it is being done. I just wanted to say that we rightly criticize the humanitarian system for doing it the wrong way around. But there are also many people who try to do things in a better way. But it's difficult. It's really difficult because they need to go against what is constantly incentivized. And
Nour, you have co-created and managed a local organization. What's accountability for you, and how has it been practiced?
Thank you, Tammam, and thanks for all panelists. And thank you for being here with you today to bring our voice. Actually, from our experience working and organizing under authoritarian regime in very difficult condition, while hate speech is raising and increasing against migrants and refugees, our accountability is starting from down to up, not from up to down. So the first step to be account is to be to have the answers firstly to the community and to receive the community needs, and after that creating the projects, not to look at the fund and the donors and see what they are looking for and what is the interest of this fund, and after that creating the project based on the interest of the international donors. So being and accountability in our context, for sure, formally NGOs have to be accountable with the donors, with reporting to the government. But if you are serving under authoritarian regime, which government you will report for, while the government itself is criminalizing your operation and stopping your operation in different ways, and reporting to this government, that means I will put the beneficiaries at risk. I will put our clients that we are serving for at risk. So accountability also is giving the answer to the community about what we are doing exactly, what we can do and what we can't, and why we can't do that, because we are not working for the community. We are a part of the community, serving with the community to have a better condition for everyone, which is I am not coming from outside with my project, serving for the community. I am a part of the community, and all together we came and we think what is the issue here and how we can resolve that issue through our programs. One of the issues to be accountable by the donors, what we see in the last 3 years of the funding cut of a political position, as we are in Germany, in Egypt as example, German fund get cutted by German government, and this fund, it was going to the New Woman Foundation, which is serving for women faced violation. And the reason of cutting the fund, it was the organization signed on a joint statement about ceasefire, demands ceasefire, just ceasefire.
It is in Gaza.
Yeah, so in Gaza, in the beginning of the attacks and the ongoing genocide in Gaza, and in this time the organization gets stuck. How can I will be accountable with my communities that I'm serving for, or I will get a step back and I will go with the political role and the political interest of the international donors. So the accountability for us is coming downward, not upward, because it's the way that we can protect our defenders, it's the way that we can continue operating under authoritarian regime, and it's the only way that we are sure the service is gonna be useful for the communities that we are working for.
Nour, let me try to unpack one thing. I agree with you. Accountability should be to the community. It assumes that a community is a homogeneous body that, has one single need or agrees on it. And I absolutely, completely agree. You sitting in Egypt would know what people would want there better than I would, and better than anyone else coming from the outside. But we also have a not very good history of having sat with people in power in the community, namely men who are wealthy, who are higher up in social status, and then took their opinion and drawn it as the will of the community. Is it knowable? To establish accountability, I will argue that we need to know what we're accountable for, and the community. How would you go about that in a place you know well like Egypt? How would you know what the community wants without us, homogenizing everybody and pretending that they are all the exact same people?
That's a very important question, and to be sure about that, we are asking us different question. Can refugees and migrants that we are serving for, they have a mechanism to questioning our decision and get real answers from our side? There are a mechanism, internal mechanism for this community to give their answers, to know how is this, to give their questions and receive a real and transparent answer from our side. The second question we are asking, are we honest about what we can do and what we can't and why we can't? Are we really honest with the community about that? And the third question, do we change our behavior or our action when we fail, or we continue on the same line while the community goes through the mechanism that it chooses and giving questions, not receiving answers, and when we fail, are we stop and take a step back and think with that community how we can fix the issue and how we can have a real answer for their question or not. So building policies, internal policies, that giving a way for the beneficiaries themselves to questioning us and receive a real answer from our side. And what we see in Sudan, it's a big lesson for all of us. When the international community failed and left Sudan and left our colleagues alone, our colleagues didn't stop. Our colleagues go with the community needs. They create the emergency rooms as example. They went with the community needs and with the community standards and thinking really how they can protecting their people without putting them at risk, while the international donors were asking some requirements could put the beneficiaries at risk. So if we can answer these questions with the community and internally with ourselves, I think we can build a way of accountability.
Thank you, Nour. And Anisha, you address this from a different angle. You work on the application of law in situations of conflict. What does, when we talk about accountability, what does it mean to you?
I will actually start from building on what Anja said, that accountability for the humanitarian organizations is to their donors, and for their donors is to the taxpayers. But it's not just to the taxpayers, right? States as donors have a responsibility in international law. And the legal framework, and I speak to Palestine because that is the case that I'm most familiar with, the donors are responsible because they're states who are a part of this international legal framework. And this legal framework, to be very, very clear, is inherently problematic in and of itself, as is the humanitarian framework. But it is a tool that we have, that we use to kind of agree that all of us are going to apply these standards and use this framework to understand where we're at, where we're supposed to be at, and where we're going wrong. When we have something like the International Court of Justice giving provisional measures orders, preliminary measures orders in as early as January 2024 on the question of a plausible genocide being committed in Gaza, the states have an obligation to international law that they ensure that their focus is on making sure that humanitarian aid is where it's supposed to be. And this is absolutely not coming in the conversation anywhere. What happens to international law in this discussion? Where are we at in that question? Who is, and yes, these questions are being litigated in the courts at the ICJ. The ICJ also had an advisory opinion back in October 2025, which was speaking specifically to this question of international organizations, their presence and operations in the occupied Palestinian territory, where it was very, very clear that these organizations let me take a step back, that the occupying power has a duty to ensure that the population under its control is kind of not starved, has the necessary conditions to live. And in that absence, have international organizations like the UN do that, and that third states are responsible to ensure that this is happening. So where is the legal accountability for the failure of the third states, the donor organizations, to ensure that there is no starvation in Gaza? And it's not a question of the last 2 years. Gaza, the calorie counting exercise in Gaza has been going on since at least the beginning of the siege. So Gaza has been on the brink of starvation, if not in starvation, at least for 17 years. So this is not something that comes up in like the last 2.5 years. This is a question that goes far beyond that. Where is the accountability in the international legal framing for donor organizations, for states?
Thank you. I usually, when I'm facilitating, while people are talking, I'm listening, and I'm trying to formulate the most polite way of directing the questions. And that's not working today.
You don't have to be polite.
I have ADHD, and I have 17 thoughts in my mind. So I will do an experiment and think out loud, so bear with me. We're talking about accountability of donors and claiming that this is a democratic exercise of accountability, when most donors do not actually disclose what are they spending money on or what. The US government used to give money out of the 60 billion that they cut to what they call democracy, including 4 billion in military aid to Israel, and that was called aid. And that wasn't disclosed to the population, or incredibly difficult to come. It is very hard to know what the German government. There has been an exercise over the years of including security and stabilization as part of the aid budgets. This includes distribution of weapons, sometimes to militias that serve the legitimate regimes that, sit within the conversation. There has been accountability has been reduced to I will give you this amount of money if you do X. You do X, I will be happy with you. What I struggle with is no one is asking, why aren't you doing Y? There have been billions. Now you look at Hungary, and there's a pride in, we will unlock the money that Hungary, Orban, far-right fascist government was trying to lock, and it'll go to Ukraine. At the same time, there's no accountability or questioning of the fact that there are still tens of millions of refugees that are in places that range from Ethiopia to South Sudan to Egypt to Cox's Bazar, that get nearly no money at all. And I think there's also neglect that cannot feel not intentional. The fact that we don't talk about most of those emergencies. The fact that we don't call out governments that are breaking international law. I mean, you're talking about accountability. We are in Germany, a democratic liberal government that continues to sell weapons to Israel and effectively is under ICC case for being complicit in genocide. If another brown or black government did that, they'd be outrageous. But it's a white government, so it gets away with it. And I want to break it down, because we can't conflate everything together. So let's talk about operational accountability. And then talk about actually narrative accountability and talk about moral accountability. Because if we conflate everything, we go into the conversation where Hans-Georg was saying, our job is to deliver aid, and that's what we should be accountable to. I'm paraphrasing and simplifying. But I don't think that's enough. So let's break it down. Operational accountability, there was a talk about the pooled funding. We, in the new Humanitarian, we have revealed actually that the pooled funding was the 2 billion with conditionalities coming from the US is problematic because they cut out 60 and then gave 2 and put more conditions, and we accepted it. But it was meant to be, and Hans-Georg said that Tom Fletcher wanted all of it to go to local organization, yet actually less than usual. Most of it went to WFP and big UN agencies. What I want to ask is, from an international organization's perspective, and you've worked with multiple, Anja, what deters us as international organizations from this sporadic accepting of conditions imposed by donor governments? What I'm saying is, what do we do to hold donors accountable, if at all?
Yeah, first of all, let me say that I agree with everything that has been said, and it is a balancing act all the time for international organizations. Actually, I guess also for national and local organizations, it's always a balancing act. Where's the red line? When do you stop accepting money? What are the strings attached you don't accept anymore, or the conditions? And we live in a time of scarcity. We live in a time where in the donor countries, most of them, populism, anti-migrants, racist voices have gotten much stronger over the past years. They always were there, but they are coming into positions of power. So I think one contribution international organizations based in the donor countries have to, one important role they have to play is to hold donors to account as well. And Oxfam is one of the organizations that has been trying to do that all the time, and has tried to go, like, to also question and criticize, and not only Oxfam, many organizations are criticizing the German government for being complicit in what is going on in Gaza and for continuing to provide Israel with weapons, and asked to suspend the association agreement between Israel and the EU, etc. So there are very strong voices in Germany and in many other donor countries, to call them in a way, to try and go against this. But unfortunately, we are in a big minority. We are in a minority in our countries as well. So yes, we can demand that. We can also put our own personal vote to parties that would defend our causes. But unfortunately, we are in a minority. And the majority in most European countries, unfortunately, is at least conservative, if not right-wing, right-extreme partly, and populist. And it's not very interesting for most citizens of these countries to support people in need, because they don't care. And this is a big, big problem we have also if we talk about telling stories. Yes, we need to tell the right stories. It's absolutely critical. And just saying one word about Gaza, I mean, we know that 220 journalists have been killed since the 7th of October 23. It's incredible, the number of journalists in this very small space that have been killed, and unfortunately many of them intentionally by the Israeli army. And we know that, and Reporters Without Borders filed cases about that. Yes, we need to tell the right stories, and the right people need to tell the right stories, but we also need people to listen to the stories, and that's the other problem we have, that there's so little interest in the northern countries. We are so worried about our economic problems and whatever, and the threat by the US, by Russia, and now also by the US, that it is very difficult to get the attention we need to these issues. And that's also why these budgets are shrinking, also in Germany. I mean, it's been cut by half. It's been cut by 2/3 since like 3 years ago or so. It's dramatic, the cuts, the shrinking aid, humanitarian aid in Germany. And we've tried to do something against it. We were not successful. So this is the other aspect we also need to have in mind. So we are here on the same side, if you wish. The problem is that we are not strong enough to convince others who defend other positions.
I mean, this is a difficult position to be in. An organization like Oxfam or any other, and they need to speak up and speak down. But that being in a difficult position doesn't mean that anything people do are right. And I want to go to you, Nour, because when we talked, you talked about the compromises people do when working locally in the context of Egypt and under an authoritarian regime. And I would love to hear about that more.
Actually, we are hearing about localization and transferring the responsibility to local actors. But if we look at how much of the fund is relocated to local actors, first of all, is very, very, very limited. Second question, who is making the decisions? The local actors that receiving that fund, or the donors and the decision makers sitting in Geneva or Brussels or whatever, or the people on the ground in Sudan, the small groups that trying to support their communities. Who is taking the decisions about the operation here? The local actors that facing the risk, or the international donors that may be facing in the last period some attacks? The third question is, what are you transferring? Are you transferring the risk without the power, or are you transferring the power to the local actor with that risk? So what we are seeing in the ground, the responsibility transferred to the local actor, which is coming with risks, but without power and without a protection. So that's the three questions in general about localization, but in the authoritarian regime's context, who is the local you are transferring the responsibility or the power to? We see that in Egypt, and before that in Libya, in Tunisia, in Syria before all of that. How is the authoritarian regimes created their local actors? So each government have their NGOs. In Egypt right now, most of the independent NGOs under attack, direct attack. Criminalization, imprisonment, enforced disappearance, accusations, and some of them forced to leave the country in diaspora in the last years. Even their operations moved from the country because of the attack. That's the independent sector. And that sector, they prevented from receiving the fund because they don't have the permission needs, because the country created policies that countering and controlling the whole sector under their hands. So now in Egypt, anyone want to operate, you need to go through 7 security agencies. 7 security permissions. Some of them we don't know. And with Gaza, with the situation, the geopolitical situation around Egypt, the ongoing conflict in Sudan, the ongoing genocide in Gaza, the unstable situation in Libya, and the interest of the EU on the border regime and the border control that makes Egypt created its hundreds of organizations, and when is the international donor coming to Egypt, the Foreign Affairs Ministry presenting those organizations, look, you want to localize the power, you want to localize the fund, that's the local actors. And you find yourself in the end in a loop of lies and hiding informations and hiding the reality of that project, while the state itself, it's full of no accountability in general in the legal term, and that organization have all the space to work while the independent in the prison or forced to be silent. So we are localizing for who? For authoritarian regime actors or for a real actors that serving for the community? That's the question here.
So I'll go back, and I come originally from Syria, and we've had a brutal military dictatorship for 40 years that took 15 years of civil war. They killed 500,000 people, and humanitarian organization had to make a decision. If you wanted to access Damascus, you needed to accept the conditions imposed by the regime. And all of them had to stay in the Four Seasons Hotel, which was the nicest hotel. So there was an expression, actually, in Arabic, which is the Four Season NGOs. And all of them stayed there, UN agencies and NGOs and so on. But if you stayed there, you cannot access opposition areas. And if you access opposition areas, you will never be given access to the regular areas. And the same thing. And I don't want to minimize the dilemma of having to make choices. I don't want to sit here and pretend that one of the choices is right or wrong. But the war in Syria is finished. Everybody has access. International NGOs are fundraising on the shoulders of Syria again. And no one even suggested remotely, let's sit and figure who was right and wrong, and what was knowable and predictable before, that we shouldn't have made the mistakes, or so we wouldn't make them again. And this is one of the lacks of accountability. Accountability is not just balancing the books, it is making choices. And I think, Anisha, I want to go to you because we have a bluntly similar situation. And I want us to talk about Gaza all the time, but I also do not want to make Gaza sound in scale and brutality. It's absolutely illegal in its own, but the politics that underline it is not different. And when we talk about the access to Gaza, I mean, it was predictable that the deregistration of organizations would have happened. Can you tell me more about that? And in your mind, what should have organizations done when they were faced? Because there is a legitimate argument. If we lose access, services get cut, more people die. I mean, no one wants to moralize on the shoulders of people who are dying. But also setting a norm where organizations can be blackmailed into doing blatantly illegal stuff, handing over the names of their staff who will be arrested and tortured and abused. Yeah. And how do you address something like that? How do you make a decision on an impossible decision, as they are called often?
Luckily, I don't work for a humanitarian organization. So I can sit and talk about what we've been talking to our partners around this question. First, of course, Gaza is not an exception. It is an exception in scale, but we can talk about this across the world in all sorts of conflict situations. And I think this is critical to understand because we've also seen what has been allowed to happen in one situation then gets pulled in as a norm in all other situations. So there is also a question of what you let happen in Gaza will happen in the next situation that we're at. So there is a broader thinking when you're making these decisions, and that interconnectedness is key and missed out a lot. But coming back to this idea of making difficult decisions, I think we're missing the point that these agencies have some sort of leverage, because at the end of the day, for example, and I'm just taking this as a random example, when France as a donor state, because I feel like we've spoken about Germany quite a bit, when France as a donor state decides that it is funding an X agency to operate inside Gaza, and then that X agency, let's say a UN agency even, that agency cannot operate in Gaza or is not allowed to operate in Gaza, they have the possibility of going back and saying, actually, you're doing this entire humanitarian exercise because you feel like you need to have your presence over there. You feel like you need to go back to your taxpayers, your voters, to say that, we're doing something here, look at us, we're participating in this conversation. But if you're not participating in this conversation, you have the possibility then for the organizations to go back and say, hey, actually, this is happening, and we will not be allowed to operate in these spaces, and we will not be allowed to actually carry out what you're asking us to do. So this is also your responsibility. And we've seen this happen. So it's not like I'm kind of creating a situation out of nowhere. There was a pushback to some extent by some states, unfortunately not the most powerful or the biggest donors, but there is space that states actually push back against such a requirement because, again, states are obliged to do this. And unless we create that incentive, political incentive inside states, that they be doing what they're supposed to be doing. Because Gaza, like Venezuela, like all the other contexts that we're talking about, does not come out of nowhere. There have been decades and decades of mismanagement by states of what they consider their political leverage, their diplomatic leverage, that has brought us to the moment that it has. In Syria, in Gaza, in everywhere else. So at the end of the day, there is a narrative that needs to be made clear that states, actually the donor states, quote unquote, are doing the donor work because they are also, like you mentioned at the beginning, want to ensure that they can also send the military aid that they're sending with it, that they're also wanting to tell their voters that they're doing this donor work, that they're also wanting to stand at the UN General Assembly and be like, oh, and we want world peace, or whatever the hell it is that they're saying these days. Like, this cannot happen. Like, organizations that have access to the situations on ground hold leverage. They're not without leverage. Yes, the conditions are difficult. Yes, the decisions are going to be really, really hard to make, but they will always be easier than they will be for our organizations inside Gaza or inside the West Bank, for that matter, or East Jerusalem. So there is the legal framework, there is the political incentives creating situations within those donor states. There is also kind of the larger, and I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but the larger military-industrial complex involved. So there's a bunch of factors that kind of give you the leverage to push back against this, because where do you stop? You will give the names and details of your colleagues on the ground, and then what?
And you've taken us appropriately from the operational accountability talking about narratives. And the narratives are historical. They haven't started 2 years ago. And this is where we have an entanglement between humanitarian actors whose job, if you boil it down to its basic context, it's saving lives here and now. There's supposedly a nexus with development and peace building. 25 years into this, I still don't know what the hell nexus is, but nevertheless. It is about saving lives. And that simplistically goes, history is not our job, politics is not our job. Our job is to go and save lives. I don't know how you do that outside history and politics. And I'm not attempting to sort of trash the context. It's a long tradition of neutrality and silence, and you're not in a conspiracy theory mindset, because, again, just 2 days ago, Palantir published a manifesto, a 22-point manifesto about the Techno-Republic, which is, just to be clear, you want to know what's the definition of techno-fascism? It's those 22 points. And it's unapologetic, and it's completely bold. People, in Arabic, we say, if you are a sinner, hide it. They don't do that anymore. So where's our role in the narrative building and sustaining? And what's our accountability to that? Please, Anja.
Yeah, thank you. I would like, because you spoke about, at the opening speech, about the humanitarianisms in plural. And I believe we really need to think about the roles of different actors, and international actors have not only the role to save lives. This is exactly to leverage the power of an international actor is absolutely critical. How can an international organization like Oxfam, for example, go beyond, like learn from the experience of the ground, rooted in the ground, say, how can we influence the government in the country, the international donor, the UN, the EU, etc. It is absolutely critical, from my perspective, that international organizations play also an advocacy role, to call it in a way, or campaign role or whatever, to go beyond saving lives, because this is really only, I mean, that there needs to be experience on the ground. It would be very strange if an international organization would talk to their government about something they don't know. So they need to have the feet on the ground. They need to work with the local communities and the actors in the country, in the place where the humanitarian needs arise. But it's an absolutely critical role to be a multiplier, an agent, for example, to influence weapon exports to an ongoing conflict like we have in Israel. And I mean, many humanitarian organizations play this role as well. And I really believe if we rethink humanitarianism, we need to think of the added value of different players in the system. And one extremely important added value of an international player is the international influence, the name. I mean, if many, and they did it when they were banned from Gaza, all these agencies, they went public, they complained about it, and of course to the governments that provided the funding they couldn't spend anymore. So this is a very important role. The question is, does it have a sufficient impact? And unfortunately, it often doesn't have a sufficient impact, but it is still important. And last word about Sudan. We were speaking about Sudan, biggest humanitarian crisis in the world. We probably wouldn't even have had a donor conference last week in Germany had not international agencies, UN, but also non-government organizations, had they not continued to speak about it, sound the alarm bell, because Sudan was simply forgotten between Ukraine and the horrible situation in Gaza. And so many other crises are forgotten. So the international agencies have that very important role, which is not just saving lives.
So I agree with you. And there is a role of advocacy, and most of the large international NGOs have advocacy offices, advocacy policies. My argument is, or my question is, have we settled in a one sort of advocacy where we wear suits and go to Brussels and pretend to inform them of stuff they already definitely know? I mean, if there is a foreign ministry or an office in Brussels that doesn't know that there's an authoritarian regime in Egypt, or that there are war crimes in Palestine and Lebanon, then they shouldn't be in that job. But we still play the role. Last year, I had the weird fortune of being on the Gaza flotilla, and a week later in the UN General Assembly. Every conceivable NGO would beg to be in the UN General Assembly, to wear a suit and mingle with the people of power and do advocacy. 0 NGOs were on the flotilla. We have deemed one as a legitimate advocacy, with half of the thugs and autocrats in the world, and the other, no, that's not humanitarianism. Is there other ways of advocacy? I completely agree, Anja, that there is a role for international organizations, namely to protect local organizations, to cover for them, to take the heat, to allow the political pressure to fall on people who aren't going to be in prison or executed or tortured or so on. And I mean, Nour, what do you want us to do? Like, you're sitting here having had to create a local organization and then having had to leave your country and having worked under an authoritarian regime. And just to illustrate it, if you haven't lived under an authoritarian regime, you don't know what the hell is an authoritarian regime. Let's be clear. If you weren't bombed, you don't know how is it to be bombed. If you haven't struggled or starved, you don't know. When I first read 1984, Orwell's famous book, I felt it's bland. That was my life. I mean, it's pretty much a poor imitation of Syria under an authoritarian regime. So what do you want people to do for you, on your behalf, and be held accountable to by you?
Yeah, I just want to say that some of the UN mechanism sometimes is pushing for a protection. Even 2 weeks ago, the national security surrounded my house in Egypt and threats my family directly. And in this moment, the UN human rights defender, the rapporteur for human rights defender, she communicated with the Egyptian government and with the mission in Geneva to speak about that. And after a long negotiation included that my work is a risk for the national security of the state. They left the house after reading the house and searching in my family personal stuff. So even the authoritarian regime is transnational, repressing the defenders and the workers. So even if I left Egypt like 3 or 4 years ago, the Egyptian government is not stopping threatening me. Even today, the government accounts, they shared our panel and saying that I'm going to hurt the state in this panel while it's going to be in the front of the international donors and a part of them giving support, I mean financially. So for me, the narrative is not separated from accountability, is the entry point. And who is owning the story is the one can recognize who is the victim and who is the threat. And it is not just about the history. The narrative in our work with refugees, while we are supporting legally in the court, in the front of UNHCR process, is shaping our legal actions. Because without this narrative, I can't go, and without the public support, I can't go under authoritarian regime to ask the judge for something. I remember that 5 years ago, it was the first time that we go to the judge to ask to recognize one of the attack as it's a discrimination action. And without documenting, without pushing for a narrative in the public opinion about that, the judge couldn't do that, and we couldn't have later an edit on the criminal law speaking about that point. So I remember that also while we work in collaboration, thanks to the new Humanitarian and the incredible support that they done with our organization on the term of documenting and going beyond this documentation to investigate this archive and matching that with satellite images, searching for more internal sources, and asking the international bodies to give answers. And it was about the detention centers, the secret detention centers that Egypt built on the desert in a military zone to detain thousands of Sudanese and pushing them back to Sudan, while the international organizations in Egypt were saying the detention of migrants decreased, while it was increasing, because the international bodies pushing for this narrative based on informations that received by the government and is the only way for this international organization. One of the organizations working with children, while the increase of detaining and deporting Sudanese and non-Sudanese children to Sudan, there were an international organization in Egypt advocating for more support for Egyptian government because it decreasing the detention of children migrants and is supporting and providing protection for children migrants. So it's not just shaping our legal action and is not just the entry point to the accountability and is not just about the history, it's also about shaping the policies and shaping the stories that impacting the people immediately. Not about tomorrow, but about this moment now. The narrative is the entry point for anything, for accountability and for anything. And that's also take us to not just speaking about the humanitarian projects on that field, but also about journalism on migration, and how is journalism is showing the migrants as a regular person crossing the borders, or as a person have the rights and carrying these rights even with irregular entry to the country. So it's a sharing responsibility between all of us, the local actors that directly impacted by this narrative, the international organizations that have communication or advocating with the states, the international donors that they have the leverage on this authoritarian regime. We are speaking about Egypt. Egypt is receiving from the EU the last package, it's 7.4 billion euro. And one of the main pillars of this agreement is controlling migration and controlling the border, so-called migration management and border control. So when we are speaking about the narrative under the authoritarian regime, we are speaking about the people life in this moment. And as much as we are speaking about operating or collaborating with authoritarian regime, we have to ask the most important question: who is monitoring the situation? When you are giving money to the border regime, to so-called migration management or border control, to a regime that militarized the border, detaining journalists, killing researchers, violating the people's rights, and not giving access to anyone, even international organizations that holding and advocating for the state narrative, they don't have access as well. So who is monitoring in this situation? So before going beyond any question with the international donors, we have to ask, who is monitoring? Brussels, you mentioned in Brussels, if they don't know, that's an issue. I believe that some of the operations that they are supporting, they don't know because they don't have access. And they don't have another option with this authoritarian regime. And that's what they are saying in public and in the meetings. So we have to, I think, all of us, get a step back a little bit about the narrative in Sudan, in Libya, in the North African countries, in our Middle East, in Gaza genocide, and ask ourselves how much the narrative we pushed in public impacted the people in the last years. And are we going in the right direction that's supporting people, or we are going in a direction that's hurting the communities we supposed to serve for them?
Thank you. Yes, Anisha.
Maybe just on the narratives a little bit. Narratives are critical to this entire exercise, but especially also to the legal process, because this entire conversation of accountability comes from setting narratives. The key idea is that you should know or should have known at this point that X, Y, and Z was happening. Today, and Anja quoted the numbers of the horrendous number of journalists that have been targeted and assassinated in Gaza, and that international media is still not allowed, is by design. Is because these narratives allow for people to go back and say, there is no starvation in Gaza. The UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, Michael Fakhri, in his last presentation to the UN General Assembly in October, said that the first child that starved in Gaza was back in February 2024. The IPC declared famine in Gaza in August 2025. What happened in all these months? It's not that the starvation didn't take place, but the difference between using the word starvation and using famine is a narrative exercise. The IPC scale for famine is challengeable at best and is absolutely out of context at worst. But that's the narrative. The narrative is that unless the IPC says there is famine, we will not mobilize around it as international organizations. But like I said, the starvation has been going on for years.
And just to clarify, the IPC definition is a technical definition.
It's a technical definition.
It is 35%, if I remember it, 35% of households unable to achieve a certain level of calorie intake. So it doesn't, you could see people dying of starvation.
You did.
Way before the definition of famine is actually
Yes.
fulfilled.
And this was documented on the ground. But it's the Palestinians. You know, you have to attach to it the whatever Ministry of Health records say this.
So I want to go back to the narrative because I wanted that, but we're drifting towards the narrative more than anything else. And I think that's really important, both for legal accountability, but for also making things unrepeatable in the future. But we have the luxury of having a long session. So before we go back to the conversation, I want to just see if anyone has questions or... Yes, please. Welcome. Yes.
So, Christine Sandvik, academic. I was a little curious in terms of your talk about voters and sort of democratic accountability. Because, you know, the definition of liberal democracies is that taxpayers do have an impact on humanitarian funding. And my sense is that, not in MSF, because it doesn't really rely on government funding, but, you know, the money's also partly disappeared because our sector has been very bad at making our case. And I have to say, I object to this sort of narrative of like ordinary people not wanting to give away money. I mean, I think blaming that doesn't really help. And you know, I don't think we should be flippant with the importance of having voter support, because there are much worse things awaiting us in Europe, unless we really, really focus on that sort of democratic grounding.
Can I say something to that? Because that's interesting. MSF is the single organization that still gets most of its funding from individual donors. I would argue that actually voters, people, individual citizens are quite generous. MSF is the one single organization that isn't going into the ground and firing half its staff and reducing operations. It's not the voters, it's the governments. I mean, the reduction, if we take that as anecdotal as it is, it's governments that aren't giving money, not voters.
You want me to respond to that?
Sorry, please.
Sure. I mean, I didn't justify, I just said it. The point is, why is the budget of the German government shrinking dramatically in humanitarian aid, cut by half? Why is that? And why are we not strong enough from humanitarian and civil society organizations to go against that? We can blame many actors, also the humanitarian and the development organizations themselves, who have not been outspoken enough. But I mean, the pressure that was put on them, there was pressure. There were conversations, of course, with policy decision makers. There is a lot of pressure that went to these. Of course, it's the government who ultimately decides. But we were not strong enough, and we used to be much stronger. And it's just a description of a reality. It's not a justification. But the populism and the right extreme narratives in countries like Germany have gained so much relevance. Of course, it's wrong. I'm absolutely against it. I try to do something against it. But it's a fact. It's one of the many facts we need to have in mind when we see at the scarcity of funding for humanitarian. It goes to military rather than to humanitarian or development or social causes in Germany. I mean, we are just in a very difficult space. I'm not justifying that this is right. It's just to say that we have to look at different actors and what
you say we got it wrong. How did we get it wrong?
Sorry?
How did we get it wrong? Like you said, we got it wrong, the advocacy or the talking about it. How did we get it wrong?
I have a personal opinion on civil society in Germany, which is very critical. I believe that humanitarian development organizations are not working collaboratively enough. They work too much in competition, and there could have been a much stronger campaign in Germany about that. There was a campaign, there were people taking to the streets, but as I said before, you also need to have people, citizens, reading and listening to these messages and these stories, and also that is reducing at the moment. So of course we need to continue working against that, and we should be much stronger, and we have to hold our governments to account. And you're absolutely right, not only on how they spend the taxpayers' money, of course not, also international law, and we also see that being undermined. We see that we celebrate politicians who still refer to international law because they have become a rare species compared to the many who just don't care anymore. And we need to continue putting pressure on them, of course. But it's obviously our means were not sufficient.
And I want to argue the form, but I want to go to questions. So please, gentlemen, and then.
Thank you for a nice discussion. I am Mansoor from London. My question is that, from donors' viewpoint, do you think that fair, independent reporting is a challenge to ensure accountability?
Sorry, can you say it? Whose report?
From donors' viewpoint,
Yes.
do you think that fair, independent reporting is a challenge to ensure accountability?
It depends. What do you mean by reporting on operations and
Operation.
I mean, it's an obligation, isn't it? There is a reporting on expenditure of money. My argument is that there isn't a reporting on the opportunity cost. And what I mean by that is we go to a place, do an assessment, and then decide to do something. And then we report on that something. We don't report on the harm done or the opportunities missed, and that might be a lost opportunity. But also, to go to the point, we consider it not our job as a humanitarian sector to report on breaches of international law that might actually change the very situation that is causing the humanitarian suffering. And this, I mean, you have been following Palestine quite closely. What is the reporting actually from humanitarian organizations on breaches of humanitarian law that they know are happening?
I think you kind of somewhere, I think you've already said this in the conversation today, there is this idea of neutrality that I would like to challenge. Because the sense has always been that we have to be neutral, otherwise we will lose access, which means we have to neutrally not take a position on what is happening. I understand. Again, I don't make these decisions, so I have the luxury to make this argument. How can we be neutral in the face of a genocide? There is no neutrality in a genocide. Or war crimes, crimes against humanity. It doesn't have to be a genocide. There is no neutrality in violations of international law, of whatever scale they are, of whoever the people are. And I feel like this is where we miss out on kind of using the leverage that I keep making the claim humanitarian organizations have to be on the ground, to have their feet on the ground, but also have the ears of the donors.
And this takes us to, so we've talked about operational and then about narrative accountability. And we still, this is an endless conversation. And I want to go back to, but that leads us to the moral accountability. And there's anyone knows Ursula Le Guin? She's a novelist who wrote science fiction and was incredible. If you haven't read her, she's amazing. One of the short stories she has written is called Those Who Walked Away from Omelos. And she talks about a utopia, a town, a city that is a utopia. Everything is perfect. But in a basement in that city, there is a child being tortured. And the continuation of the wealth and good life of that city is predicated on that child continuing to be tortured every day. And at a certain age, they tell people in the city, this is why we're rich, this is why we're happy. And most people live with it. Some, though, walk away. And that's the whole story, that there is a choice. And my question is, we can talk about the utility of being neutral or silent or activist or so on. We can talk about access or non-access, and I doubt that we have the predictability we pretend to have. That if I don't say anything, I will always have access. It's a bit dogmatic this way. But is there a moral imperative that supersedes, both because if we accept this genocide, there's no reason to not accept the next one, and because it falls outside the whole moral narrative that is the raison d'etre of humanitarianism? Where's the line? And the line has been perceived differently. The ICRC pretends that there's nothing. What genocide? The International Rescue Committee calls people affected by genocide clients. So to apply to them a non-existent agency as if they have a choice. And you go all the way. And it's not necessarily a predictor, but my question to you is, what's the moral responsibility? What's the limit? Anisha, you said any breaks in international law. I mean, I would say then we wouldn't be anywhere because the German police breaks the international law in protests in Berlin. So it's really hard to put a limit that narrow. Where's the space of compromise when it comes to what's happening and when it comes to what could happen or where things are going? And I just want to see if you have a way of discerning a limit. Yes, please.
I mean, because everybody is breaking international law, we cannot use that as a threshold. Is a bit of a, where do we go from here? So yes, international law is not like I mentioned already, it has its own internal characteristic flaws that are imperialistic in nature because it was written by a few people when they were colonizing the rest of the world. So nothing great about international law here, but it's a common agreement. The question of morality is far, in my opinion, easier to answer because it's as a humanitarian agency, it is not okay for you that one child is being tortured if the city is burning because if the city is functioning fine, because it will be replicated everywhere. And we have seen this boomerang come back to the heart of the empire in the US, in Germany, in other spaces. What you allow to happen in one place will come back to you. This is not a one-off thought. This is how history has operated. What you see on the streets of Berlin is because you let it happen in the streets of Israel.
Absolutely. And I thank you for mentioning that, because the imperial boomerang is actually an argument that was made by Aimé Césaire in Discourse on Colonialism. Yeah. And he said, whatever we allow to happen in the colonies will turn around and happen in the metropole. And that was part of his argument on why colonialism of Europe has allowed for Nazism to grow at home, because it was normalized in the colonies, then it became possible for it to happen at home. And it's funny how a 70-year-old text feels so prominent today. Anja, how should we think about our moral responsibility, which supposedly supersedes a lot else?
Contrary to Anisha, I find it particularly difficult to talk about moral responsibility or accountability because moral is something very subjective and people have very different interpretations of what is morally right or wrong. So I rather try not to use that concept too much. But I do believe, also what Anisha said, we do have, the fact that we have international law is not, it just didn't fall from the sky. It was hardly, it was a hard work to get to some general standards, also in humanitarian work. I mean, to get to these general standards was difficult, was hard work. And we need to hold our decision makers to account, ourselves and our decision makers as well, because these, it's just because we currently have a situation in history where presidents just do as though there was just absolutely no international law system anymore, doesn't mean that we need to buy into that. On the contrary, I think we need to be much stronger all the time to hold everybody to account, ourselves and also our decision makers, to comply with these standards and with these laws. And that's one of the important roles of civil society, to not stop calling for that and and really demanding it all the time. And this is what I would hope that we do much more and much more clearly and much louder in civil society. Just constantly remind everybody that these standards have been it has been, it has been, I don't know in English now the word, but it was a huge achievement to get to some international standards, which it was not good enough, as you said in the opening. What we had 10 years ago was absolutely not good enough, but it was still a little bit less up for discussion to have international rules and laws and standards. And we need to at least go back to that. Hopefully we in contrary to what people seem to feel here in the audience, that there's little hope for the humanitarian system to really change in a way that we really need it. But we still need to continue working towards that. Otherwise, the situation would be even much worse.
Thank you. I'm always told that in discussions like this, you should end up with, what do we do now? Give people like a positive, uplifting thing. I'm not going to do that. I think we need to stew in the problem a little bit. I think we need to internalize it before we pretend to have solutions immediately, because if those problems had a solution that could be come up with in 90 minutes, we wouldn't have had them. So I'll ask you a question. In that story, if you were a resident of that city where a child is tortured, who of you would have stayed? Anyone would have decided it's worth it if all the city lives in luxury and peace and there's no crime. Anyone would have stayed? No, but raise your hands if you think you would have stayed. Not a single one. Yet all of us, yeah. Yes, please. Let's take this and yes, go ahead. We'll go.
Sorry, but does staying mean that there is an opportunity for me to actually help that child?
No.
No, okay, no.
It's implicated that what she says is that's the whole, you could take him out, but the city ceases to be as rich and happy as it is. It's a supernatural condition for the continuation of.
If I may, the fact that nobody raised their hand, I think, oh, you did? Oh, sorry, but most of us probably, yeah. I just wanted to say that, like, moral accountability, just to the point that was just mentioned right now, probably is not something that's just, subjective. It's like we all are human beings. We share human values. When we see something, we would do it. Of course, there are extremists, fascists. This is what we're seeing, how we're seeing the world at the moment. And probably this is why we kind of lost the narratives years ago, and right now we're kind of restoring it by people movement and organizations trying to actually talk more and more about genocides and conflicts and people affected. But I think there would be better words to actually label it, especially that you've been talking a lot about accountability and came back to narratives, and then when you allowed the kind of the floor for questions, nobody came back to the point that was mentioned by the panel about narratives, and what you've mentioned as well about organizations in Syria not asking themselves, why didn't we do this before with that regime? So I think reflection in general is very important in any exercise or panel that we're trying to discuss about humanity, accountability, morality, or anything about that, especially about our work of being neutral in crisis situations.
Thank you. Can I just take a word from there? Yes, please.
Yeah, I put my hand up just now when you asked that question because I think this is, for me, this is very close to the comparison with, Nazi Germany, and I'm German, and would I have stood up? And I think it's very easy to now say, I would have left that town, I would have stood up, I would have fought the Nazis, because we're now, externals, and we can judge that situation very differently than when you're brought up in a certain system and with perhaps certain moral values that we would now deem wrong. So I think, there's not to be apologetic about anything, but I think it's to be humble.
I think you're absolutely right.
I think that is very crucial, and I think it actually comes back to a point that we touched on earlier also with the question of the academic lady in front of me, that we still need to really fight for our ideas to be recognized and to be taken up by others in our society, and to not just do the advocacy with the politicians that we try to, in the end, get funding from and support from, but from the voters, from the constituencies, from those who should join our civil society organizations and also work for those now moral values that we have.
Now, thank you very much, because I just want to say, I wasn't trying to moralize and say you should leave. What I'm trying to say is we all think we will leave. When we all are part of the system, we are in the city, we are in places where poverty exists and we go to restaurants and eat fancy meals. We are in places where we get paid more than we deserve and others get paid nothing. We are in places where you're born, no one is throwing away their passports and because, someone else doesn't get a visa, so I'll burn my passport. That doesn't happen. We're all in the bloody city. And the question is there anything we can actually do? And I will have, because they allowed us until 35, so I'll take a couple more comments. And I want to hear from Patrick, because Patrick has been on LinkedIn reversing the anthropological narrative and writing about an African discovering Europe in the same language that is still used about Europeans discovering the rest of the world. And you can't imagine how agitating this is to people. So Patrick, please.
My question has nothing to do with that. This is
I want people to go to your LinkedIn and read it.
It's completely different. When you all started the discussion, you spoke about accountability to the community. And I feel like that has kind of disappeared in the discussion. And I'd like you to explain what that actually means. Because you're accountable to the donors because they can impose a consequence on you if you don't do something. They can withdraw the funding. They can take it anywhere, they can cut it. What does it mean to be accountable to the community? What can the community actually do to enforce or to impose a consequence? And is there a way that we can create organizations that allow for societies and communities to actually have the power to impose consequences on them?
Thank you. I will take another 2 comments before, I'm sorry, but they will kick us out. So one and then one.
And in the back of the room.
Oh, yes, of course. Let's take them all. Start from here. Not all, like 3 or 4 comments, and then give a closing statement, please. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for all your insights. It's actually helped me realize something. And as an anthropologist, I will gladly follow up on you. And it connects to what the exercise the Tammam just gave and the quote of David Graeber, anthropologist, politics versus policy. And I think a lot of times we are talking about what people say they do instead of what people really do. Especially in working on humanitarian organizations, you see this the whole time, that when you look at organizations on the ground, international, national organizations, they actually do very different things from what they say they are doing to get funding, to have reporting. And sometimes I feel that this also on this policy level, we talk about those Potemkin villages instead of what actually happens, like those known secrets. We all have those known secrets, and I would really love to hear from you, how can we include those to make humanitarianism better and include those also in those spaces, like those truths that we know to be true.
The lady there has had her hand up long, and then one in Hassan. It's funny when you're facilitating and you actually know the first names of like 24 people in the room. Yes.
Thank you so much. I'm Anastasia. I'm working with OCHA Syria in Damascus. So just back to the torture of the child story in this ideal city. It's really good to see that no one would stay in the city. But let us go back to reality. Isn't what the world leaders and the people who are writing our narrative want us to see the torture of the children, the famine, the killings, the arrest, everything to be normalized? Isn't what they want us to, when we're scrolling our phones and see all these horrific videos from all over the world, especially from Gaza, to see that this is normal? This is our new normality and reality, to kill the humans inside all of us? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take a last comment and then we will close.
Hi, Hassan, former MSF. I think there is just one small accountability which is still missing, and that is the accountability to ourselves, the accountability of humanitarians to the humanitarian principles. I think when we stopped being accountable to the humanitarian principles, slowly and gradually, the goalpost kept moving away from us to a point where Anisha rightly mentioned that we don't even know what humanitarian law is anymore. Which brings us back to the question that if MSF 10 years ago can refuse 60 million euros of funding from the EU governments, which did not make it poor, it was a conscious choice, and believing in what? Believing in the fact that that deficit would eventually be met by individual donors and their generosity, which did happen. Just earlier today, the gentleman mentioned that OSHA did accept the conditions, which means that it again gave away a part of that humanitarian ethos that we all believed in. And slowly and gradually, we will have nothing left fighting for. Which brings us back to the point. If the religion of humanitarianism is capitalism, if we agree that it is capitalism, then to what extent? Tomorrow, for instance, if big arms corporations, big gas companies start donating to humanitarian organizations, should we start accepting funding from them? No, there has to be red lines that we draw for ourselves, and there has to be a point where we stop giving in as well. And I rest my case.
Thank you. I will give like a closing remark and address whatever you can and are interested in. I'll start with you.
Thank you for all the notes from the people here. It made me reflecting on what I tried to write before coming to the panel. And actually, about the moral accountability for me is the line of the people's rights. So when we agree, and it's more visible in migration externalization, as example, when we are looking at Libya or at Egypt, while the EU is shifting the responsibility, giving the money to authoritarian regime, and pushing also the international organizations to deal with that regime. The line here is the people right. When we are seeing that people get forced to leave Egypt because the life, it's impossible right now because of the detention or the arrest or the death at detention right now for Sudanese, included women and the children. And after that, we see the numbers coming from some international organizations saying that it's a voluntary return. That's not a natural. That's complicit in these actions. So for me, we are accountable first to the communities we are serving for, before the donors, before the international community, before everything, the people themselves right, and naming the things as it is, and sharing the knowledge and sharing the informations about the violation that the people are receiving, because the violation is violation. something we can't change the name. What we need to do, actually, I don't know exactly, and I think we can't have an answer right now. But we have to reflect on all of us, on our actions in the past at least 10 years and look back what we had done. And it's not just about the numbers in the report, it's about the people life. So are we improving the lives of the people? Are we protecting the people rights, even being so-called natural? That protected the people in Syria, in Egypt, in Libya, in Gaza, anywhere, and questioning ourselves, reflecting on ourselves in all the levels, and having this type of discussions in a more deep way and more regular between the actors in each location that they are working together in. So the line is the people right, and the morality is the people right, and the violations that the people are receiving, and the number, it doesn't mean anything if we are not improving and protecting the people's rights and protecting them from violation.
Thank you, Nour. I'll move to Anja, please.
Yeah, thank you. So many rich contributions. I'll limit myself to maybe 2 points. One is I do see concrete changes. They are far too little about local accountability to local actors and to the communities we serve. There have been many, many attempts to do this right. There have been studies, there have been researches, there have been projects which have been documented in order to distribute the learning. And there are people, many people, who take this very seriously, this commitment, which was taken 10 years ago in the context of the Grand Bargain. It's small pieces, as much as also the funding going as directly as possible to local actors is it's small, but it has happened. And the German government just reported that 22% of their funding goes as directly as possible to local actors. It is not enough, but I really want to encourage us to look into the positive examples and to see how we can build on that, and everybody take their own responsibility and their own agency. We all are agents ourselves, so we all can try to contribute to these developments and not get all the time frustrated only. I mean, there's many reasons to be frustrated, but I think we are agents ourselves. We all can contribute, and it's very important to look into positive examples. And the professional, also international, but also local and national organizations, they can contribute, and they do contribute in a very positive way to also to change the humanitarian system in itself.
Thank you. Thank you, Anja.
I will keep it brief. To the last comment from the audience, thank you for bringing capitalism into this discussion. I feel like we can do another round and session on it, but it's also racialization. It's not just capitalism, it's racializing the entire exercise is a massive problem. I gave the impression that I find morality questions easy. I don't, but I will kind of take us back to international law, because at the end of the day, it is a shared vocabulary that we have. We have a shared language that we work with, and if we are all agreeing, like the last panel did, that the political realities of the world are what they are today and we need to accommodate them, one could argue that we have international legal realities that we should then be also taking into account and pushing for when we're dealing with states. So if we are making the political accommodations that we are making, we're not neutral anyway. So why aren't we doing the same with the legal mechanisms that we have? So, yeah.
Thank you very much. I feel uneasy because we haven't answered the questions, but that is an intentional purpose. I genuinely don't think coming up with answers just so we could feel better about where we are is a good enough. There are way too many questions about accountability. What I want to say is, those who know me well know that I'm not that optimistic or, joyful type, but it's also important to acknowledge that we do gravitate towards critique, and sometimes very harsh critique of ourselves or our sector. Yet, as problematic as things are, it is necessary to acknowledge that if we actually agree on the narrative that most humanitarians are local humanitarians working in their communities, most organizations are composed of people who are on the ground, those are still there, and they are saving lives, and they are doing the best they can within the context they can. Coming to terms with good people in a structurally violent system is a very hard exercise. But we can't, by acknowledging the violence of the system, we can't negate the goodness of the people who are working in it and the good they are doing to others. And to them, and they are at more danger than ever and at more discredit than ever. To them, I think we should give our gratitude because they are doing the work in the hardest places. We get to sit on panels and theorize about stuff. So with that in mind, I thank you very much, and I apologize for my, as always, bad timekeeping.